Hello everyone. Today, Biker Justice Analyst bring you a story full of humanity and compassion. Enjoy listening.
A shy nurse spoke to a Hell's Angel secretly. Unknowing, he was the CEO of the hospital. The morning light filtered through the glass doors of St. Margaret's Hospital as Caroline Winters pulled her cardigan closer, trying to ward off the autumn chill. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway as she made her way to the nurse's station, arriving 15 minutes early as usual. She liked these peaceful moments before the daily chaos began. Carolyn adjusted her light blue scrubs and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The familiar scent of disinfectant and coffee filled the air as she settled into her routine, checking patient charts and organizing her tasks for the day. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. Morning, Caroline? Sarah, another nurse, called out cheerfully as she breezed past the station. Carolyn managed a small smile and quiet hello in return, but kept her eyes focused on her work. She'd learned long ago that staying busy helped her avoid awkward small talk. The hospital slowly came to life around her. Doctors arrived with their white coats swishing, nurses changed shifts, and the hallways filled with the steady beeping of machines and squeaking wheels of medical carts. Through it all, Carolyn moved like a shadow, efficient but nearly invisible, just the way she preferred it. She went about her morning rounds, checking vitals and administering medications. Her gentle touch and soft voice seemed to calm even the most agitated patients, though few noticed the careful attention she paid to every detail of their care. By mid-morning, the charge nurse approached her station. "Caroline, we have a new patient in room 412. He was transferred from ICU last night. Could you handle his care today?" "Of course," Caroline replied, accepting the chart. She studied it briefly. Male patient, early 40s, recovering from pneumonia complicated by underlying conditions. Nothing she hadn't handled before. As she approached room 412, Caroline took a deep breath and squared her shoulders, preparing herself for the introduction. She knocked softly before entering. The sight that greeted her made her pause momentarily. The patient was a large man who seemed to fill the hospital bed despite his weakened state. His arms, visible beneath the short-sleeved hospital gown, were covered in elaborate tattoos. A thick, dark beard framed his face, and even in sleep, there was something imposing about his presence. Caroline moved quietly to check his IV and vitals, trying not to wake him. But as she adjusted the blood pressure cuff, his eyes fluttered open. They were surprisingly gentle, a warm brown that held a hint of weariness, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Caroline, and I'll be your nurse today. How are you feeling?" The man, Ben, according to his chart, studied her for a moment before answering in a gravelly voice. "Been better." He shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. Carolyn noticed his discomfort and adjusted his pillows with practiced efficiency. "The pneumonia can make everything ache for a while," she explained, keeping her eyes on her task, rather than meeting his gaze directly. "I'll bring you something for the pain in a few minutes." She continued her assessment professionally, asking necessary questions and recording his responses. Despite his intimidating appearance, there was something in his manner that tugged at her heart, a vulnerability that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. She noticed he had no cards or flowers on his bedside table, no personal items except a worn leather jacket draped over a chair. Still, Caroline maintained her professional distance, speaking only when necessary and focusing on her duties. When she finished, she gave him a small nod. "I'll be back with your medications shortly," she said, turning to leave the room, her footsteps as quiet as they had been when she entered. Caroline's hands trembled slightly as she approached room 412 later that afternoon. She paused outside the door, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Something about Ben's presence made her more self-conscious than usual, though she couldn't explain why. "Time for your afternoon check," she announced softly, stepping into the room. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. Ben was sitting up in bed, his broad shoulders making the hospital gown seem too small. He looked up from a magazine and nodded. "Caroline, right?" His deep voice was gentler than she expected. "Yes." She busied herself with the blood pressure cuff, avoiding direct eye contact. The steady beep of the monitor filled the silence between them. Her fingers brushed against his tattooed arm as she secured the cuff, and she noticed intricate designs of eagles and motorcycles woven among other symbols she didn't recognize. "Your blood pressure's improving," she said, recording the numbers on his chart. "How's your breathing today?" "Better." Ben shifted in the bed, and Caroline noticed him wince slightly. "Still feels like I'm breathing through a wet blanket sometimes, but not as bad as yesterday." Caroline nodded, reaching for the stethoscope around her neck. "I need to listen to your lungs. Can you sit forward a bit?" She placed the stethoscope against his back, hyper-aware of their proximity. "Deep breath, please." Ben complied, his breathing still raspy but clearer than the day before. The room felt smaller somehow, and Caroline found herself holding her own breath without realizing it. "You know," Ben said as she finished her examination, "I appreciate how quiet you are. Some of the other nurses—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "They mean well, but sometimes the chatter is too much." Caroline felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected compliment. "I just try to let patients rest," she murmured, adjusting his IV line. "Well, it helps. This recovery—" He paused, running a hand through his beard. "It's been harder than I expected. Never been good at being weak, you know?" The vulnerability in his voice made Caroline look up, meeting his eyes for the first time that day. There was a weariness there, but also something else. A gentleness that seemed at odds with his intimidating appearance. "Recovery takes time," she said softly, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "Even strong people need patience." Ben's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Thanks for that. And thanks for—" He gestured vaguely. "Just thanks." Caroline nodded, suddenly aware of how long she'd been in the room. She gathered her supplies, trying to ignore the strange flutter in her chest. This wasn't like her. She never felt this uncertain around patients, never felt this pull to know more about them. "I'll be back to check on you before my shift ends," she said, backing towards the door. As she stepped into the hallway, she pressed a hand to her warm cheek, confused by her reaction to him. There was clearly more to Ben than his tough exterior suggested, and that realization both intrigued and unsettled her. She walked quickly back to the nurse's station, trying to push away thoughts of gentle brown eyes and unexpected kindness. She had other patients to attend to, she reminded herself firmly. She couldn't afford to be distracted by one man's story, no matter how much she wanted to understand it. Caroline walked into room 412 the next morning, clipboard in hand. The early sunlight painted the walls in soft golden hues, and there was Ben, a massive silhouette against the window. He sat in one of the visitor chairs, still in his hospital gown but looking stronger than the day before. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and their eyes met. The smile he gave her was small but genuine, softening his weathered features. Caroline felt her usual nervousness fade slightly at his welcoming expression. "Good morning," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's nice to see you up and about." Needed a change of view? Ben gestured at the cityscape beyond the window. Gets pretty boring staring at these four walls all day. Caroline hesitated, then set her clipboard down on the bedside table. Hospital stays can be really difficult, she offered, surprising herself with her boldness. Especially when you're used to being active. Ben's shoulders tensed slightly, then relaxed. Yeah, he agreed, his deep voice rougher than usual. Used to being the one in charge, you know? Moving around, making things happen. Now I can barely walk to the bathroom without getting winded. Caroline pulled up the other chair, maintaining a professional distance, but close enough for conversation. It's temporary, she reminded him gently. Your test results are improving every day. I know, he sighed, running a hand through his beard. Just never been good at sitting still, or being alone with my thoughts. The admission hung in the air between them. Caroline watched as Ben's gaze drifted back to the window, his expression distant. No family coming to visit? She asked carefully. Ben shook his head. No family. Few acquaintances, but... He trailed off, then gave a hollow laugh. Funny thing about being the tough guy everyone's scared of. Doesn't leave much room for real connections. Caroline felt something twist in her chest. Despite his imposing presence, there was raw honesty in his words that resonated with her own experiences. I understand that, she said softly. Sometimes it's harder to let people in than to keep them at a distance. Ben turned to look at her, really look at her, and Caroline fought the urge to drop her gaze. You seem to do all right, he said. The other nurses clearly like you. Caroline felt her cheeks warm. They're nice to me because I'm quiet and do my job, but... She twisted her hands in her lap, surprised at her willingness to share. I've always struggled with feeling like I belong, like I'm not quite good enough, you know? So I stay in the background, keep to myself. Afraid of letting people see the real you? Ben's voice was gentle, understanding. She nodded, throat tight. It's easier that way. Safer. But sometimes... She took a shaky breath. Sometimes the loneliness feels like it might swallow me whole. Yeah, Ben said quietly. I know exactly what you mean. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, both looking out at the city below. Caroline felt oddly lighter, having shared even that small piece of herself. When she glanced at Ben again, she saw her own vulnerability reflected in his eyes, despite his tough exterior. The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of the medication cart rolling down the hallway. Caroline stood, smoothing her scrubs. I should get back to my rounds. Ben nodded, but before she could reach for her clipboard, he said, Thank you, Caroline, for understanding. Caroline returned to Ben's room later that afternoon, carrying a small paper bag. She'd noticed he hadn't touched much of his lunch earlier, and something about his loneliness had tugged at her heart. I brought you something, she said, placing the bag on his bedside table. The kitchen makes these amazing oatmeal cookies on Thursdays. They're not exactly on your prescribed diet, but... She gave a small, conspiratorial smile. Ben's eyes crinkled at the corners as he reached for the bag. Been a while since anyone snuck me contraband. He took a bite and nodded appreciatively. These are good. Real good. They remind me of the ones my mom used to make, Caroline said, settling into the chair beside his bed. When she had time, anyway. She worked 2 jobs, so home-baked cookies were a rare treat. Ben studied the cookie thoughtfully. Never had much of that growing up. Home-baked anything. He brushed some crumbs from his hospital gown. Foster homes aren't big on the personal touch. Caroline's heart squeezed. You were in foster care? Yeah, bounced around a lot. He shrugged, but Caroline could see the tension in his shoulders. Learned pretty quick that looking tough was the best way to survive. By 16, I was running with a rough crowd. Felt more like family than anything else I'd known. The tattoos? Caroline ventured carefully. Ben's hand unconsciously went to his forearm, where intricate designs peeked out from under his gown. Yeah, each one's got a story. Not all of them good ones. He gave a wry smile. Bet you never thought you'd be sharing cookies with an ex-biker. I try not to judge people, Caroline said softly. Everyone's fighting their own battles. You're different, you know that? Ben's voice was gruff but warm. Most people see the tattoos, the attitude, and they run the other way. But you just see people. Caroline felt her cheeks flush. I'm not different. I know what it's like to feel invisible sometimes. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sharing the cookies. Ben told her more about his younger years, about the streets that raised him and the choices that shaped him. Despite the hardness of his stories, there was something gentle in the way he told them, as if sharing them with her somehow softened their edges. When Caroline's watch beeped, signaling the end of her break, she stood reluctantly. I should get back to my rounds. Thanks for the cookies, Ben said. And for listening? Caroline smiled and gathered her things. As she walked down the hallway, she heard voices coming from the nurses' station. She recognized Sarah, one of the senior nurses, talking to Dr. Phillips. Can you believe the CEO is actually staying here as a patient? Sarah was saying. I mean Ben Harrison himself, in a regular room like any other patient. Caroline froze mid-step. Well, that's Big Ben for you, Dr. Phillips replied. Built this hospital network from nothing. Goes from running with the Hells Angels to running a healthcare empire. Man's a legend, but he's never been one for special treatment. Caroline's hand went to the wall for support. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Ben, her patient, the man she'd just shared cookies with, the former biker who'd opened up about his foster care past, was the CEO of St. Margaret's Hospital? She thought about their conversations, the vulnerability in his eyes, the way he'd listened to her own insecurities. Her mind struggled to reconcile the gentle man she'd come to know with the powerful figure everyone seemed to fear and respect. Caroline stood there, her heart pounding, as other staff members walked past her. Everything she thought she knew about Ben had just shifted dramatically, and she had no idea what to do with this new information. Caroline's hands trembled slightly as she checked Ben's chart the next morning. The knowledge of his true identity weighed heavily on her mind, making her usual morning routine feel like walking through thick fog. Everything looked different now. The private room she'd thought was just standard suddenly seemed significant. The way other staff members glanced in while passing no longer seemed casual. She took a deep breath before entering his room, reminding herself to stay professional. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice higher than usual. "I'm here to check your vitals." Ben looked up from his tablet, a slight frown crossing his face at her formal tone. "Morning, Caroline." He set the device aside, watching as she moved around the room with unusual stiffness. The silence between them felt heavy, nothing like the comfortable quiet they'd shared just yesterday. Caroline focused on the blood pressure monitor, avoiding his eyes as she wrapped the cuff around his arm. Her movements were mechanical, precise, and completely unlike her usual gentle approach. "Pressure's good," she murmured, making a note in his chart. She moved to check his temperature, still not meeting his gaze. "Did you get home all right last night?" Ben asked, his voice casual but kind. "Weather turned pretty nasty after your shift." Caroline nodded quickly. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Harrison." She busied herself adjusting his IV line, though it didn't need adjusting. Ben's hand moved slightly, as if he wanted to reach out, but he kept it at his side. "You know, Those cookies yesterday were probably the best thing I've eaten in weeks. Caroline felt her cheeks flush. Had she really given the CEO contraband cookies? Had she actually sat there sharing stories about her childhood with him? The memory that had been warm yesterday now made her want to sink through the floor. "I'll make sure the kitchen sends up appropriate meals from now on, sir," she said quietly, moving toward the door. "Is there anything else you need?" Ben's expression shifted, a mix of understanding and something that might have been disappointment crossing his features. "No, thank you, Caroline. I'm fine." Throughout the day, Carolyn kept her interactions with Ben brief and professional. When she needed to check on him, she made sure to come in when other staff members were present. She focused on her tasks, speaking only about medical matters, and left as quickly as possible. During her afternoon rounds, she found Ben sitting in the chair by the window, looking out at the city below. For a moment, she saw again the lonely man who'd shared stories of foster homes and hard times. But then she remembered the conversations she'd overheard about his power and influence, and she quickly looked away. "Your afternoon medication, Mr. Harrison," she said, placing the small paper cup on his table. "Caroline," he said softly, but she was already heading for the door. "The evening nurse will be in to check on you in a few hours," she said, her hand on the doorknob. "Please use the call button if you need anything." Ben didn't try to stop her, didn't demand she stay and talk. He just watched her with those same understanding eyes as she left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. Standing in the hallway, Caroline pressed her clipboard against her chest, trying to steady her racing heart. It was better this way, she told herself, more professional, more appropriate. She'd forgotten her place yesterday, but she wouldn't make that mistake again. Carolyn stared at the blinking cursor on her computer screen, trying to focus on updating patient records. The words kept blurring together as her mind wandered back to Ben's room. Her desk phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. She picked it up, her voice professional and measured. "Fourth floor nurses station, this is Caroline." "Caroline?" Ben's deep voice came through the line, sounding strained. "I know you're busy, but would you mind sitting with me for a few minutes?" She gripped the phone tighter, her free hand fidgeting with her pen. "Is everything all right, Mr. Harrison? Should I call Dr. Matthews?" "No doctors needed," he said quietly. Could you come? Please?" Caroline glanced at her computer screen, then at the clock. She should say no. Should tell him she was too busy. Should maintain that professional distance she'd been working so hard to rebuild. "I'll be right there," she heard herself say. The walk to his room felt longer than usual. She knocked softly before entering, finding Ben sitting up in bed, looking uncomfortable, but not in any obvious medical distress. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to the chair beside his bed. Caroline sat down stiffly, keeping her eyes on his vital signs monitor. "Are you experiencing any pain, Mr. Harrison?" Ben sighed heavily. "You know, I hate being called Mr. Harrison. Makes me feel like my old man." He shifted in the bed, wincing slightly. "The guys in the club used to call me Big Ben. Seemed fitting, given—" He gestured to his large frame. Caroline remained quiet, but her posture softened slightly at the touch of humor in his voice. "Look," Ben continued, his voice growing serious. "I see how different you've been since yesterday, and I get it. Finding out who I am, it changes things for most people. It's just—" Caroline started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "Just what?" Ben prompted gently. "It's inappropriate," she blurted out. "The things I told you, the cookies, the stories. You're the CEO of this hospital." Ben laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You want to know something? This tough guy act, the stern CEO routine, it's all just smoke and mirrors." He ran a hand through his beard, looking suddenly vulnerable. Truth is, I'm terrified most of the time. Terrified of making the wrong decision, of letting people down, of people seeing past the facade. Caroline looked up, startled by his admission. You know why I liked our talks? He continued. Because you treated me like a person. Not a former gang member, not a CEO, just me. Do you know how rare that is? Caroline's voice faltered as she processed his words. Every day, I walk into meetings wearing expensive suits, making decisions that affect hundreds of people's lives, Ben said, his voice dropping lower. And every day, I wonder if someone's going to figure out I'm just a kid from the wrong side of the tracks playing dress-up. Something in Caroline's chest loosened as she watched this powerful man share his insecurities. His hands, which she'd always seen as intimidating, now fidgeted with his blanket just like she did with her pen when nervous. The tattoos, he gestured to his arms. They're not just for show. They're reminders of where I came from, who I used to be. Sometimes I think I keep them visible just to make sure I never forget. Never get too comfortable in this new life. Carolyn found herself leaning forward slightly, her earlier tension beginning to fade. As she looked at Ben now, she didn't see the CEO of St. Margaret's or the former biker. She saw someone who, like her, struggled with feeling out of place, with being enough. Caroline paused outside Ben's room, her hand hovering over the door handle. Her shift had ended 15 minutes ago, but something kept pulling her back here. Through the window, she could see Ben sitting up in bed, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing emphatically as he spoke. She was about to turn away when he caught her eye and waved her in. Carolyn entered quietly, trying not to disturb his conversation. The change in his demeanor was immediate and striking. Gone was the vulnerable man from their earlier talk. In his place sat someone else entirely. Listen, Johnson, I don't care what the board thinks about the budget cuts. Ben's voice boomed through the small room. Those numbers aren't touching our nursing staff, period. He ran a hand through his beard, his jaw set firmly. No, you're not hearing me. I said no. Find the money somewhere else. Carolyn busied herself checking his IV line, pretending not to listen. But she couldn't help noticing how his presence seemed to fill the room, how his voice carried authority without effort. This was the CEO everyone talked about in whispered tones. Look, I've got another meeting, Ben said firmly into the phone. We'll discuss this tomorrow. And Johnson, the nursing staff is non-negotiable. He ended the call with a sharp tap on his phone screen. The silence that followed felt heavy. Carolyn finished adjusting his IV and stepped back, suddenly unsure of herself again. I'm sorry you had to hear that, Ben said, his voice softening to the tone she'd grown familiar with. Business doesn't stop just because I'm stuck in here. It's fine, Caroline replied, fidgeting with her badge. You were defending the nursing staff. Yeah, well, Ben shifted uncomfortably in his bed. Some people forget that hospitals are about people, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. He set his phone aside and looked at her directly. But that's not why I'm apologizing. I hate being that person. The harsh voice on the phone, the tough guy in the boardroom. Caroline moved closer to his bed, drawn by the sincerity in his voice. You seemed very different, she admitted. That's because it's all an act, Ben said, running his hands over his face. Big Bad Ben, the ex-biker turned cutthroat CEO. It's exhausting, you know? Always having to be larger than life, always having to be the toughest person in the room. But you're good at it, Caroline observed. The way you handled that call. I'm good at pretending, he corrected her. Been doing it so long sometimes I forget who I really am. He looked down at his tattooed arms. Sometimes I think the only real parts of me are these tattoos and the memories they represent. Carolyn sat in the chair beside his bed, her earlier uncertainty forgotten. You don't have to pretend with me, she said softly. I like the real you better anyway. Ben's expression softened, the CEO mask falling away completely. You know what? I like the real me better too. He gave her a small, genuine smile. Thank you, Caroline, for seeing past all this. He gestured vaguely at himself. You don't have to thank me for that, Caroline replied, feeling more comfortable than she had all day. Just be yourself. The evening sun cast long shadows through the hospital room window as Caroline settled more comfortably in her chair. Ben had insisted she stay a while longer, and somehow the usual anxiety she felt about social interactions had melted away. I never wanted to be a CEO, you know, Ben said, adjusting his position in the hospital bed. Growing up, I just wanted to ride motorcycles and feel free. He chuckled, a deep rumble that filled the quiet room. My old man worked in a factory his whole life. Always told me I'd end up just like him. Caroline nodded, thinking of her own childhood. My mom worked 2 jobs, she shared, surprising herself with her willingness to open up. She was a waitress during the day and cleaned offices at night. I barely saw her. Must have been lonely, Ben said softly, his eyes showing genuine understanding. It was. Caroline twisted her hands in her lap. I spent a lot of time in my room, reading books. I guess that's where I learned to be quiet, to stay in the background. And now? Ben asked, his voice gentle. Caroline looked down at her hands. Now it's just easier to stay that way. Safe, you know? Safe isn't always better, Ben replied. He shifted, wincing slightly. Look at me. I spent years building this tough guy image. Started in the Hells Angels, thought that was the only way to be strong. But real strength? He shook his head. It's in being yourself, even when it scares you. How did you go from being in a motorcycle gang to running a hospital? Caroline asked, genuinely curious. Ben's face softened with memory. Had a friend get hurt bad in an accident. The care he got here at St. Margaret's, it changed everything. Made me want to do more. Be more. He looked at her intently. What about your dreams, Caroline? What does your heart want? The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in years. I don't know, she admitted. Sometimes I think about starting a support group for patients' families. They often seem so lost, so afraid. She blushed, expecting him to dismiss the idea. That's beautiful, Ben said instead. You see people's pain, their needs. That's a gift, Caroline. Don't hide it. His words touched something deep inside her, making her throat tight with emotion. They talked for another hour, sharing stories about their lives, their fears, their hopes. Ben told her about his first business venture, a motorcycle repair shop that helped him transition out of gang life. Caroline shared her secret dream of writing children's books about healing and hope. Later that night, Caroline drove home through the quiet streets, her mind full of their conversation. She thought about how easily Ben had shared his vulnerabilities, despite his powerful position. How he'd listened to her without judgment, encouraging her to dream bigger. Pulling into her apartment complex, she sat in her car for a moment, letting the reality of the evening wash over her. All these years, she'd built walls to protect herself from rejection, from pain. But what had those walls really protected her from? Connection, growth, life itself. She walked to her apartment, the night air cool against her skin. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe, just maybe, the world wouldn't reject her if she showed her true self. Ben's words echoed in her mind. Real strength is in being yourself, even when it scares you. For the first time in years, Caroline felt ready to try. The morning light streamed through the hospital windows as Caroline made her way to Ben's room for his routine checkup. Her steps were lighter today, The usual weight of anxiety lifted somewhat from her shoulders. When she entered, Ben was already sitting up, reading through some papers. "Morning," he said, his deep voice warm and friendly. He set the papers aside, giving her his full attention. "Good morning," Caroline replied, surprising herself with how steady her voice felt. "How are you feeling today?" "Better." Ben stretched his arms. Amazing what a good night's sleep can do. As Caroline checked his vitals, their conversation flowed naturally. She found herself telling him about her childhood pet, a scraggly rescue cat named Shadow that had been her only real friend growing up. "Shadow would wait by the window every day until I got home from school," she said, adjusting the blood pressure cuff. "He was the only one who really saw me, you know?" Ben nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I had something similar," he shared. "A beat-up Harley Davidson that I rebuilt from scratch. Spent more time with that bike than with people." He chuckled. "Guess we all find comfort where we can." "What made you start rebuilding motorcycles?" Caroline asked, noting his blood pressure on the chart. "My uncle had a garage," Ben explained, rolling down his sleeve. "He taught me everything I know about bikes. Said I had magic hands." His expression softened with nostalgia. "He was the first person who believed in me, showed me I could be more than just another tough guy on the streets." Caroline smiled, checking his temperature. "He sounds wonderful." "He was." Ben's voice grew quiet. "Lost him to cancer 5 years ago. That's partly why I got involved with the hospital. Wanted to make sure other families had better options than we did." The vulnerability in his voice touched something in Caroline. She found herself sharing more about her own life, her dreams of helping others, her fear of stepping into the spotlight, the small victories that kept her going. "You know," Ben said thoughtfully, "sometimes the scariest steps lead to the best places." He paused, seeming to consider something. "Speaking of which, would you like to have lunch with me? Outside the hospital, I mean. There's a nice little cafe around the corner." Caroline's heart skipped a beat. The invitation was unexpected, and her first instinct was to retreat, to make an excuse. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the genuine warmth in Ben's eyes, or maybe it was the memory of their conversations about being brave. She started, her hands fidgeting with her stethoscope. "Won't people talk? I mean, you're the CEO and I'm just someone I'd like to have lunch with," Ben finished simply. "No titles, no hierarchy, just two people sharing a meal and good conversation." Caroline felt a flutter of nervous excitement in her stomach. This was different from their hospital room talks, more real, more intentional. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "I'd like that." Ben's face lit up with a genuine smile, making his tough exterior soften completely. "Great. How's tomorrow at noon?" "Tomorrow at noon," Caroline agreed, feeling both terrified and hopeful about what this step might mean. The small cafe around the corner from St. Margaret's Hospital was tucked away from the busy streets, its weathered brick exterior and window boxes full of bright flowers creating a cozy atmosphere. Caroline sat across from Ben at a corner table, nervously smoothing her napkin in her lap. Ben looked different outside the hospital, wearing a crisp button-down shirt instead of a hospital gown, though his tattooed arms and thick beard still marked him as someone who didn't quite fit the typical CEO mold. He studied the menu with the same intensity he brought to everything else. "I recommend the grilled cheese," Caroline offered quietly. "They use 3 different kinds of cheese." Ben's face broke into a warm smile. "Comfort food, huh? I like that." He set down his menu. "You know, I can't remember the last time I had a simple grilled cheese. Most of my meals these days are at fancy restaurants with board members." When their waitress came, Ben ordered the grilled cheese, and Caroline chose her usual soup and sandwich combo. As they waited for their food, Caroline noticed how Ben's shoulders seemed to relax, how his usually commanding presence softened in this informal setting. "It must be hard," she said, surprising herself with her boldness, "having to be different things to different people all the time." Ben's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're more perceptive than most," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, it's challenging. In the boardroom, they expect the tough CEO who can make hard decisions. With the medical staff, they want a leader who understands healthcare. With investors, they want someone polished and sophisticated." He shook his head. "Sometimes I forget who I really am underneath all those roles." Their food arrived, steam rising from the perfectly grilled sandwiches. Caroline watched as Ben took his first bite, grinning at his obvious enjoyment. "This is fantastic," he said. "Better than any five-star restaurant meal I've had recently." "Sometimes the simple things are best," Caroline replied, stirring her soup. "Like genuine conversations." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "You know, that's what I appreciate about you, Caroline. You see people for who they are, not what they represent. It's rare in my world." Caroline felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "I just try to be kind," she said. "Everyone has their struggles, even CEOs." "Especially CEOs," Ben chuckled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "The higher up you go, the lonelier it gets. Fewer people who'll tell you the truth, fewer genuine connections." They continued eating, sharing stories about their lives. Ben told her about his early days with the Hells Angels, how he'd learned leadership the hard way, and his journey to legitimacy. Caroline found herself fascinated by the contrast between his past and present, how he'd managed to bridge two such different worlds. As their plates emptied and the lunch hour drew to a close, Ben's expression grew serious. "Thank you for this, Caroline," he said softly. "Being here, talking like this, it's the most human I've felt in years. No pretenses, no expectations, just real." Caroline felt something warm bloom in her chest, not just pride, but a deeper sense of worth. If someone like Ben, who had seen and done so much, valued her company this much, maybe she had more to offer than she'd thought. Maybe her quiet way of caring, of seeing people's true selves, was a strength rather than a weakness. Carolyn made her morning rounds, checking on Ben's progress with a newfound ease in her manner. His vital signs were improving daily, and she felt a quiet satisfaction in being part of his recovery. The morning sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, casting warm patches across the sterile floors. "Blood pressure's looking good today," she said, making a note on his chart. "And your heart rate is steady." Ben nodded, but seemed distracted, his eyes fixed on his phone. Carolyn noticed the deep furrows in his brow, the tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there during their lunch the day before. As she left his room, voices from the adjacent corridor caught her attention. She recognized the sharp tone of Dr. Richardson, one of the board members, speaking in what he probably thought was a hushed voice. "The numbers don't add up," Dr. Richardson was saying. "Someone's been cooking the books for months. This could bring down the entire hospital." Caroline froze, her hand still on Ben's door handle. Another voice, belonging to the hospital's financial director, responded with clear anxiety. "The audit team is going through everything, but it's bad, James. Really bad. Ben's going to have his hands full dealing with this mess." Her heart began to race. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the conversation confirmed the subtle changes she'd noticed in Ben's demeanor. The way he'd been checking his phone more frequently, the hushed calls he'd been taking, the worry lines around his eyes. Later that afternoon, Caroline was organizing supplies in the storage room when Ben found her. He looked exhausted, his usual commanding presence diminished by whatever weight he was carrying. "Carolyn," he said softly, closing the door behind him. "Do you have a minute?" She set down the box of gauze she'd been holding. "Of course." Ben ran a hand through his beard, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of stress. I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it from me first. He leaned against the metal shelving unit. The hospital is in trouble? Serious trouble? Caroline's stomach tightened, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. I actually overheard something about that this morning. Financial irregularities, Ben continued, his voice rough. Someone's been embezzling funds, and it's gone unnoticed for months. As CEO, I'm responsible for this mess, whether I knew about it or not. Caroline stepped closer, wanting to offer comfort but unsure how. What does this mean for the hospital? It means I have to focus everything I have on fixing this. His eyes met hers, and she saw the conflict there. The next few weeks, maybe months, are going to be all about damage control, board meetings, audits, legal consultations. He trailed off, running his hand through his beard again. Caroline felt her chest tighten. She understood what he wasn't saying, that their growing friendship, their lunches, their conversations would have to take a back seat to this crisis. I'm sorry, Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know I've really valued our... He struggled to find the right words. I understand, Caroline said, though her heart felt heavy. The hospital has to come first. Ben straightened up, and Caroline could almost see him pulling his CEO persona back around himself like armor. Thank you for understanding, he said, his voice more formal now. I should get back to my office. There are some calls I need to make. Caroline watched him leave, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The storage room suddenly felt colder, emptier, and she worried that this was just the beginning of a greater distance between them. The next few days at St. Margaret's Hospital felt different. The corridors seemed longer, the lights dimmer, and the usual bustle felt muted to Caroline as she went about her duties. She watched Ben from a distance, noting how he'd transformed back into the intimidating CEO everyone else knew him as. Gone were their quiet conversations and shared moments. Instead, she caught glimpses of him striding through hallways, surrounded by men in expensive suits. His face had hardened into stern lines, his shoulders rigid with tension. When their paths crossed, he barely acknowledged her with more than a quick nod. During her morning rounds, Caroline passed by the conference room where Ben was holding yet another emergency meeting. Through the glass walls, she could see him gesturing at charts and speaking intensely to a group of board members. He looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of coffee could fix. Did you hear? Whispered Sarah, another nurse, as they restocked supplies together. They're saying there might be layoffs if things don't improve. Caroline's hands trembled slightly as she arranged gauze pads. Where did you hear that? It's all anyone's talking about in the break room. Sarah leaned closer. I saw Mr. Harrison yesterday. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. The worry gnawed at Caroline's stomach. She wanted to help Ben, to offer him the same kind of support he'd given her, but every time she tried to catch his eye or find a moment to talk, he was already rushing to another meeting or locked away in his office. One afternoon, she brought his medication to his room. He was still technically a patient, after all, only to find him on his phone, pacing. He held up a hand as she entered, signaling her to wait. The numbers don't lie, he was saying, his voice gruff with frustration. We need to cut deeper. Yes, I understand the implications. He glanced at Caroline, then turned away. We'll discuss this at tomorrow's board meeting. Caroline set the medication on his bedside table, trying to ignore the ache in her chest. As she turned to leave, Ben covered the phone with his hand. Thank you, he said quietly, but his eyes were already back on the papers spread across his bed. That evening, after her shift ended, Caroline stood in front of the mirror in the staff bathroom. Her reflection showed the toll the past few days had taken. Dark circles under her eyes, tension in her shoulders. She thought about how Ben had encouraged her to be brave, to find her voice. Maybe it was time to take his advice. With determined steps, she made her way to the executive floor. The hallway was eerily quiet, most of the staff having gone home for the day. Ben's office door was closed, but light spilled out from underneath it. Carolyn took a deep breath and raised her hand to knock. But before her knuckles could touch the wood, she heard voices inside. Another late meeting. She waited, minutes ticking by, until finally the voices faded and the door opened. A group of suited executives filed out, but Ben wasn't among them. "Excuse me," she asked one of them, her voice smaller than she intended. "Is Mr. Harrison still inside?" "He left through the other door," the man replied, barely glancing at her. "Had to rush to another meeting across town." Caroline stood there in the empty hallway, staring at the closed door. The connection she'd felt with Ben, the understanding they'd shared, it all seemed to be slipping away like sand through her fingers. She placed her hand on the cool surface of his office door, then slowly let it fall back to her side. The walk back to the nurse's station felt longer than usual, each step heavier than the last. Caroline's small apartment felt emptier than usual that evening. She sat curled up on her worn sofa, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold on the coffee table beside her. The city lights twinkled through her window, but they offered little comfort tonight. Her mind kept replaying every interaction with Ben, analyzing each word and gesture. Had she imagined the connection between them? Maybe she'd read too much into his kindness, mistaking professional courtesy for something more meaningful. "You're such a fool," she whispered to herself, pulling her knees closer to her chest. The sound of traffic below filled the silence of her apartment. She thought about how different Ben seemed now. Not the vulnerable patient who'd shared his fears with her, but the stern CEO fighting to save his hospital. The transformation was jarring. It felt like the Ben she'd known had disappeared, replaced by someone she barely recognized. Getting up from the sofa, Caroline wandered to her tiny kitchen. She opened her refrigerator, stared at its sparse contents, and closed it again without taking anything. Her appetite had vanished days ago, replaced by a constant knot in her stomach. The clock on her wall ticked steadily as she paced her living room. 9:45 p.m. She should try to sleep. She had an early shift tomorrow, but just as she was about to head to her bedroom, someone knocked on her door. Caroline froze. Nobody ever visited her this late. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Caroline?" Ben's voice, muffled through the door, made her heart skip. "I know it's late, but can we talk?" Her hands trembled as she approached the door. Through the peephole, she saw Ben standing there, still in his suit, but looking disheveled, his tie loosened and hair slightly messy. When she opened the door, the harsh hallway light cast shadows across his face. He looked exhausted, the weight of recent events evident in the slump of his shoulders. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I know I've been—" He ran a hand through his hair, searching for words. "I've been pushing everyone away." Caroline stepped back, wordlessly inviting him in. Ben entered hesitantly, as if unsure of his welcome. "The hospital," he started, then stopped. "No, that's not right. I'm not here to talk about the hospital." He turned to face her directly. "I'm scared, Caroline. Everything's spinning out of control and I fell back into old habits. When things get tough, I shut down, push people away." "I noticed," Caroline said quietly, wrapping her arms around herself. "I convinced myself I needed to be the tough CEO everyone expects me to be, but doing that—" He sighed heavily. "I hurt you, and that's the last thing I wanted to do." Caroline felt tears prickling at her eyes. I thought maybe I'd imagined it all, the connection we had. You didn't imagine anything. Ben took a step closer. That was real, is real. When things started falling apart, I panicked. Control is all I've ever known. It's how I survived in the gang, how I built my career. But with you, his voice softened. With you, I don't have to be in control all the time, and that terrifies me. I understand fear, Caroline whispered. I've let it rule my whole life. They stood in silence for a moment, the truth of their shared vulnerability hanging in the air between them. The morning sun streamed through the windows of St. Margaret's Hospital cafeteria, casting long shadows across the nearly empty tables. Caroline sat across from Ben, both of them nursing cups of coffee. The usual morning bustle hadn't started yet. It was too early for the regular crowd. I meant what I said last night, Ben said, his deep voice softer than usual. He wore a casual sweater today instead of his usual suit, making him look more approachable. I don't want to lose what we have because of my position or the hospital's problems. Carolyn wrapped her hands around her warm coffee mug, drawing comfort from its heat. I understand the pressure you're under, she said, but I need to know that you won't shut me out again. That's fair. Ben leaned forward, his expression serious. I've spent years building walls, Caroline. It's not easy for me to let people in. He paused, considering his words carefully. But when I'm with you, those walls don't feel necessary. The honesty in his voice made Caroline's heart flutter. She watched as he absently stirred his coffee, his large hand somehow gentle with the delicate plastic stirrer. Maybe we could start over, Caroline suggested, surprising herself with her boldness. Not as CEO and nurse, just as us. A genuine smile spread across Ben's face, softening his usually stern features. I'd like that, he said. In fact, I have the afternoon off. Would you like to get lunch? There's a small park near here I've always wanted to visit. Caroline hesitated for just a moment before nodding. I'd like that too. Later that afternoon, they walked side by side through the small park. The autumn air was crisp, and fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet. They'd picked up sandwiches from a local deli and found a quiet bench overlooking a small pond. It's strange, Caroline said, watching a family of ducks glide across the water. I've lived here for years, but I've never been to this park. Too busy taking care of everyone else to explore? Ben asked gently. Caroline smiled ruefully. Something like that. I guess I got comfortable in my routine. It felt safer that way. I understand that better than you might think, Ben said. He unwrapped his sandwich thoughtfully. Running the hospital, I got stuck in my own routines. Everything was about maintaining control, keeping up appearances. And now? Now. Ben looked at her, his eyes warm. Now I'm sitting in a park, eating a sandwich with someone who sees past all that. Someone who saw me as just another patient needing care. Caroline felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't look away. For the first time, she truly saw Ben, not as the intimidating CEO or the vulnerable patient, but as someone who understood her in a way few others did. They ate in comfortable silence, sharing occasional observations about the park or the people passing by. There was no pressure to maintain appearances, no need to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. As the afternoon sun painted the pond in golden light, Caroline felt something shift inside her. The constant anxiety that had been her companion for so long seemed to ease. Here, sitting beside Ben, she felt grounded, present in a way she hadn't experienced before. Thank you, she said quietly. Ben turned to her, raising an eyebrow in question. For showing me that change doesn't have to be scary, she explained. That sometimes it can be peaceful. Ben's smile was gentle, understanding. Thank you for showing me the same thing. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and elegant decorations. Caroline fidgeted with the hem of her navy blue dress, feeling out of place among the well-dressed hospital board members and wealthy donors. She had almost declined Ben's invitation to the annual charity gala, but something in his eyes when he asked had made it impossible to say no. You okay? Ben appeared beside her, looking distinguished in his dark suit. His presence was oddly comforting now, rather than intimidating. Just nervous, Caroline admitted, accepting the glass of water he offered. I'm not used to fancy events like this. You look fine, Ben assured her, his voice gentle. Just be yourself. The evening progressed with speeches and presentations about the hospital's achievements. Caroline found herself relaxing slightly, content to observe from her corner table. She watched Ben work the room, noting how different he seemed in this setting. Professional, yet approachable, commanding respect without intimidation. Then Ben took the podium, and Caroline's world shifted. Before we conclude tonight's presentations, he began, his deep voice carrying across the hushed room, I'd like to recognize someone special. His eyes found Caroline's. Caroline Winters has shown me what true dedication to patient care looks like. Caroline's heart stopped. Heat rushed to her cheeks as heads turned in her direction. In my time as both CEO and, recently, as a patient, I've witnessed firsthand her extraordinary compassion, Ben continued. She reminds us all that healthcare isn't just about numbers and procedures. It's about treating people with dignity and understanding. The board members, usually stern-faced and businesslike, were nodding in agreement. Carolyn's hands trembled in her lap as Ben spoke about her gentle approach with patients, her attention to detail, and her quiet strength. Carolyn represents the very best of St. Margaret's, Ben concluded. Her work embodies the values we should all strive to uphold. Thank you, Caroline, for showing us what genuine care looks like. Applause filled the room. Caroline felt tears pricking at her eyes as several board members smiled warmly in her direction. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to be noticed, let alone praised publicly. After the speeches ended, Ben found her near the dessert table, where she'd retreated to collect herself. I hope I didn't embarrass you too much, he said softly. Caroline wiped at her eyes, careful not to smudge her makeup. I never thought... She struggled to find the words. No one's ever noticed before. I notice, Ben said simply. You've helped me more than you know, Caroline, not just as a nurse, but as a person. You showed me it's okay to be vulnerable sometimes. Looking up at him, Caroline saw the sincerity in his eyes. In that moment, all her years of feeling invisible, of thinking her quiet way of caring didn't matter, seemed to melt away. Ben saw her, really saw her, and valued what he saw. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ben smiled, his eyes warm with pride. No, Caroline. Thank you. The morning headlines hit like a thunderbolt. St. Margaret's Hospital faces financial crisis, screamed across the front page of the local newspaper. Carolyn's hands shook as she read the article during her break. The situation was worse than she'd imagined. The hospital needed millions to stay afloat, and rumors of layoffs were already spreading through the corridors like wildfire. She found Ben in his office later that day, surrounded by stacks of financial reports and budget documents. His normally commanding presence seemed diminished, his shoulders hunched as he pored over the papers. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept much. I brought you some coffee, Caroline said softly, placing the cup on his desk. Ben looked up, managing a weak smile. Thanks. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion evident in every movement. I've been going over these numbers for hours, trying to find a solution that doesn't involve letting people go. Caroline's heart ached seeing him like this. She settled into a chair across from his desk, wanting to help but feeling powerless. Is there anything I can do? Unless you've got a few $1 million hidden away. Ben attempted to joke, but his voice was strained. He picked up a report and waved it frustratedly. The board's breathing down my neck, demanding immediate action. They want cuts. Deep ones. The staff is worried, Caroline admitted. Everyone's talking about it. They should be, Ben said grimly. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. I built this place up from nothing, Caroline. Turned it from a struggling community hospital into something special. And now... His voice cracked slightly. Now I might have to watch it all fall apart. Caroline rose and joined him at the window. You don't have to face this alone. Don't I? Ben turned to her, and for the first time she saw real fear in his eyes. I'm the CEO. The buck stops with me. If I fail... He paused, swallowing hard. If I fail, hundreds of people lose their jobs. Patients lose their care. Everything I've worked for, everything I've built, gone. Ben, Caroline said gently, touching his arm. Look at me. He did, and she saw the vulnerability there, the same kind he'd shown during his time as a patient. You're not just the tough CEO anymore, she continued. You're the man who showed me that it's okay to be scared sometimes. That strength isn't about never showing weakness. It's about facing our fears and moving forward anyway. Ben's expression softened. When did you get so wise? I learned from you, Caroline replied. You taught me that I'm stronger than I think. Now it's my turn to remind you of your strength. Something shifted in Ben's eyes, a spark of determination replacing the fear. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. You're right. I can't let fear paralyze me. There has to be a solution, and I'm going to find it. And I'll help however I can, Caroline assured him. We all will. The staff here believes in you, Ben. They believe in what you've built. Ben nodded, some of his old confidence returning. Thank you, Caroline, for seeing past my tough exterior, for being here when I needed someone to talk to. That's what friends are for, she said simply. Friends, Ben repeated softly, a small smile playing at his lips. I'm going to fight for this hospital, Caroline, whatever it takes. The morning sun filtered through the hospital windows, casting warm patches of light across the bustling corridors. Caroline noticed something different in the air, a lightness that hadn't been there during the past few weeks of uncertainty. Staff members smiled more, their steps seemed lighter, and conversations in the break room had shifted from worried whispers to cautious optimism. She watched as Ben talked with a group of nurses near the reception desk. His sleeves were rolled up, and he was gesturing animatedly, his face brightened by genuine enthusiasm. Gone was the haunted look that had shadowed his features during the darkest days of the crisis. We're implementing a new patient care program, he was saying. It's not just about the numbers anymore. We're going to focus on what makes this hospital special, our people. Caroline couldn't help but smile as she organized patient charts. Ben had been working tirelessly, but instead of just cutting costs, he'd found creative solutions. He'd negotiated better supply contracts, streamlined administrative processes, and even convinced several board members to take pay cuts rather than lay off staff. Later that afternoon, she found him in the pediatric ward, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a young patient who was showing him her favorite stuffed animal. The sight of the imposing CEO, still in his suit pants and dress shirt, completely engaged in a child's play, made Caroline's heart warm. Mr. Bear says you're doing a good job, the little girl declared solemnly. Ben chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Well, that means a lot coming from Mr. Bear. Thank you. He noticed Caroline watching and gave her a small wave. After promising the young patient he'd visit again, He joined Caroline in the hallway. "The board approved our new wellness initiative," he said, falling into step beside her. "We're going to be able to keep everyone on staff and even add some new positions in patient care." "That's wonderful news," Caroline replied, genuine relief in her voice. "The whole hospital feels different today." "I've been thinking," Ben said, his tone turning more personal. "These past few weeks have reminded me what really matters. It's not just about keeping the hospital running, it's about the connections we make, the lives we touch." They stopped by a window overlooking the hospital gardens. The spring flowers were beginning to bloom, adding spots of color to the landscaped grounds. "I've got a cabin up in the mountains," Ben continued, somewhat hesitantly. "Nothing fancy, but it's peaceful. I was thinking of heading up there this weekend, clear my head a bit." He paused, then added, "Would you like to come along?" Caroline felt her pulse quicken slightly. "To your cabin?" "Just as friends," Ben assured her quickly. "We could both use a break from the hospital, don't you think? There's a lake nearby, some hiking trails. It might be nice to see each other somewhere that doesn't have fluorescent lighting and antiseptic smell." Caroline looked at him. Really looked at him. The tough exterior that had first intimidated her now felt familiar, comfortable even. She saw the warmth in his eyes, the gentle way he waited for her answer without pressing. "I'd like that," she said softly. "A weekend away sounds perfect." Ben's face lit up with a genuine smile. "Great. We can leave Saturday morning, if that works for you." "Saturday's perfect," Caroline agreed, feeling a flutter of excitement in her stomach. As they parted ways, Carolyn felt lighter than she had in weeks. The hospital was healing, and maybe, just maybe, something new and wonderful was beginning to bloom, like the flowers in the garden below. The gravel crunched under the tires as Ben's truck wound its way up the mountain road. Carolyn watched the scenery change from city buildings to dense forest, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The morning air coming through the cracked window was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles. "Almost there," Ben said, navigating a curve. "Just around this bend." The cabin appeared through the trees, a sturdy structure of wood and stone that seemed to grow naturally from the mountainside. It wasn't the luxury retreat Caroline had half expected from a hospital CEO. Instead, it was modest and welcoming, with a wide porch and windows that caught the morning light. "It's beautiful," Caroline breathed, taking in the peaceful setting. Ben smiled, parking the truck. "It's not much, but it's real. No pretenses up here." They carried their bags inside, and Ben showed her around. The interior was cozy, all warm woods and comfortable furniture, with a stone fireplace as the centerpiece. Large windows looked out over the lake below, its surface sparkling in the sun. "The kitchen's stocked," Ben said, "and there's a trail down to the lake if you want to take a walk later." They settled into a natural rhythm, preparing lunch together in the small kitchen. Caroline noticed how different Ben seemed here. More relaxed, his movements easier, the tension he usually carried in his shoulders melted away. After lunch they sat on the porch, mugs of coffee warming their hands. The quiet between them felt comfortable, broken only by bird songs and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "I used to come here when things got too intense with the angels," Ben said suddenly, his voice soft. "It reminded me there was something more than just power and control." Carolyn turned to look at him, surprised by his openness. "What made you leave that life?" she asked. Ben was quiet for a moment, watching a pair of chickadees flit between the trees. "I realized I wanted to build something instead of tear things down. The hospital gave me that chance." "And now?" Caroline asked. "Now?" Ben set his mug down. "Now I'm learning there's even more to build than I thought. Connection. Trust. Things I never thought I deserved." The afternoon passed with more conversations like this, honest, unguarded moments where they shared pieces of themselves they usually kept hidden. They walked down to the lake, skipped stones across the water, and talked about their hopes and fears. Caroline told him about growing up with her single mother, about the loneliness she'd carried for so long. Ben spoke about his struggles to balance his tough exterior with his desire for genuine connection. As the sun began to set, they sat close together on a fallen log by the water's edge. The lake reflected the sky's changing colors, orange and pink bleeding into purple. "I feel like I can breathe up here," Caroline said softly. Ben nodded. "That's exactly it. Down there, we're the CEO and the nurse. Up here, we're just us." "Is that what you want?" Caroline asked, her heart beating a little faster. "Just us?" Ben turned to face her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. He reached for her hand, his larger one enveloping hers with gentle strength. "I want to build something real with you, Caroline," he said, his voice deep and sincere. "Both at the hospital and whatever this is between us, if you'll let me." Caroline felt tears prick at her eyes, but for once they weren't from sadness or fear. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt truly hopeful about the future stretching out before her. The morning sun streamed through the windows of St. Margaret's Hospital, casting long shadows across the newly renovated nurses' station. Caroline couldn't help but smile as she watched the staff gather around for their morning meeting. The atmosphere had changed dramatically over the past few weeks. Gone were the rigid protocols and cold efficiency that had once defined the hospital. In their place, Ben had implemented changes that put people first. The break room now had comfortable chairs and a proper coffee machine. The scheduling system had been revamped to prevent burnout. Even the lighting had been softened to create a more welcoming environment. "Morning, everyone." Ben's deep voice carried across the room as he approached. He wasn't wearing his usual suit today, but rather dark slacks and a comfortable sweater. The staff no longer tensed when he walked by. Instead, they greeted him warmly. Carolyn watched as he stopped to chat with a young nurse who'd been struggling with night shifts. His genuine concern was visible in the way he leaned in to listen, nodding thoughtfully at her concerns. This was the Ben she'd gotten to know at the cabin, the one who cared deeply about others but had hidden it for so long behind a tough exterior. Later that morning, Caroline found herself in Ben's office for their weekly staff wellness meeting. The room itself had changed. The imposing desk was gone, replaced by a comfortable seating area with chairs arranged in a circle. "The stress management workshops are making a difference," Caroline reported, reviewing her notes. "Staff morale is up, and sick days are down by 30%. Ben nodded, his eyes warm with pride. "That's your doing, Caroline. You saw what this place needed before anyone else did." Caroline felt her cheeks flush at the compliment, but she didn't look away. She'd grown more confident in her abilities, more comfortable with recognition. "We all needed this change," she said. "Even you." "Especially me," Ben agreed with a small laugh. He shifted in his chair, pulling out a folder from beside him. "Which is why I wanted to talk to you about something." Caroline watched as he opened the folder, her heart beating a little faster. "The board has approved my proposal for a new wellness program," he continued. "It's going to be a full department, focusing on both patient and staff well-being. We'll need someone to head it up, someone who understands the importance of compassion in healthcare." Caroline's breath caught as Ben slid the folder across to her. Inside was a formal job offer. "Head of Wellness Programs," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "The position would give you oversight of all wellness initiatives," Ben explained. "Staff counseling, patient support programs, family services, everything we've talked about implementing. You'd have the resources and authority to make real changes." Caroline looked up from the paper, her eyes meeting Ben's. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," he replied. You've shown everyone what true compassion looks like, Caroline. You helped me remember why I wanted to run this hospital in the first place. There's no one better suited for this role." Caroline felt tears welling up in her eyes as she looked back at the offer letter. This wasn't just a promotion. It was an opportunity to help others the way she'd always wanted to. To make the hospital a place of healing, not just for bodies, but for spirits, too. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." Ben's smile was gentle. "You never have." Caroline stood in her new office, running her fingers along the nameplate on her desk that read, "Director of Wellness Programs." The morning light filtered through the large window, warming the small but comfortable space she'd made her own. Photos of nature scenes hung on the walls, and a diffuser filled the air with calming lavender. She glanced at her schedule for the day. Her first wellness program initiative was launching today, a support group for nurses dealing with workplace stress. The old Caroline would have been terrified at the thought of leading such a group, but now she felt ready. A knock at her door made her look up. Ben stood there, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this before your big meeting," he said, walking in and setting 1 cup on her desk. "Thanks," Caroline smiled, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I was just going over my notes one last time." "You're going to do great," Ben said, leaning against the wall. He looked different these days, more relaxed, the hard edges softened. His beard was neatly trimmed, and though he still cut an imposing figure, there was a gentleness about him that put people at ease. "The nurses seem excited about the program," Caroline said, taking a sip of her coffee. "3 departments have already asked about starting their own groups." Ben nodded, pride evident in his expression. "That's because they trust you, Caroline. You've shown them what real leadership looks like, leading with compassion instead of authority." Caroline felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. She'd been receiving more of those lately, and though they still made her blush, she was learning to accept them. "I learned from the best," she said, meeting his eyes. They worked together throughout the morning, their easy partnership evident in the way they moved through meetings and consultations. Caroline's voice, once barely above a whisper in group settings, now carried confidence and warmth. She found herself naturally stepping into her role as an advocate for staff well-being. By afternoon, Caroline's first support group had concluded successfully. As she gathered her materials, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The nurses had opened up, sharing their struggles and supporting each other. It was exactly what she'd hoped to create, a safe space for healing and growth. She found Ben waiting for her in the hospital courtyard, their usual meeting spot. The spring air was mild, and the cherry trees were beginning to bloom. He sat on their favorite bench, his jacket off and sleeves rolled up, looking more like the man she'd first met as a patient than the CEO of a major hospital. "How did it go?" he asked as she sat beside him. "Better than I expected," Caroline replied, feeling the tension leave her shoulders. "They really opened up. One nurse even thanked me afterward, said it was the first time she felt truly heard at work." Ben smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "That's what you do best, Caroline. You make people feel heard." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the cherry blossoms flutter in the breeze. Caroline thought about how far they'd both come, from a shy nurse and a guarded CEO to partners in transforming the hospital's culture. "Remember when you were my patient?" Caroline asked softly. "I was so scared to even look you in the eye." Ben chuckled. "And I was trying so hard to keep up my tough guy act. Look at us now." Caroline squeezed his hand back, feeling the strength and gentleness in his grip. They'd found something rare, a connection built on seeing past each other's facades to the truth underneath. In helping each other grow, they'd both found themselves. The hospital boardroom buzzed with tension as Ben stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding yet calm. Caroline sat to his right, her tablet ready with the data they'd spent weeks gathering. The issue at hand was serious. A competing hospital network was attempting a hostile takeover of St. Margaret's. "They're offering our shareholders triple their current returns," one board member announced, his voice sharp with worry. "We can't compete with those numbers." Caroline watched Ben carefully. In the past, this kind of pressure would have made him retreat behind his tough exterior. But today, he remained steady, his eyes clear and focused. "Numbers aren't everything," Ben said, his deep voice filling the room. He nodded to Caroline, who pulled up their presentation on the main screen. "Over the past 6 months," Caroline began, her voice strong and sure, "our patient satisfaction scores have increased by 40%. Staff turnover has dropped to its lowest rate in 10 years. She moved through the slides with confidence, showing the impact of their wellness initiatives and community outreach programs. Ben stepped forward. "What our competitors don't understand is that St. Margaret's isn't just about profit margins. It's about people." He shared stories of lives touched by their new approach, stories that Caroline had helped him collect. As the meeting progressed, Caroline and Ben worked in perfect sync, addressing concerns and presenting solutions. When board members raised objections, they handled them together. Caroline provided the human perspective, while Ben tackled the business angles. "We've built something special here," Ben explained, his voice passionate. "Something that can't be measured in dollars and cents." Caroline added, "Our staff isn't just staying, they're thriving. Patients aren't just getting treatment, they're finding hope." The board meeting lasted hours, but by the end, they'd convinced the majority. St. Margaret's would remain independent, maintaining its new culture of compassion and care. As the board members filed out, Ben and Caroline stayed behind, both exhausted but relieved. The evening sun cast long shadows through the boardroom windows. "We did it," Caroline said softly, gathering her materials. Ben moved closer, taking her hand. "We did. And it made me realize something." He led her to the window, where they could see the hospital grounds below. Staff members were walking the paths. Patients sat in the garden they'd created together, and the whole scene glowed in the golden light. "Look at what we've built together," Ben said, his voice gentle. "This place, it's transformed, and so have we." He turned to face her fully. "I don't want to do any of this without you, Caroline. Not the hospital, not life, not anything." Caroline's heart swelled as she looked up at him. Gone was the intimidating figure she'd first met in that hospital room. In his place stood a man who'd learned to be both strong and vulnerable, just as she had learned to be both kind and confident. Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I want us to be partners in everything," he said, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "What do you say?" Caroline looked at the ring, then at the man holding it, the man who'd helped her find her voice, who'd shown her that strength could be gentle and that love could be brave. In his eyes, she saw their shared future, built on the foundation of trust and understanding they'd created together. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Partners in everything." The morning sun streamed through the windows of St. Margaret's Hospital as Caroline walked down the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She paused to chat with a nurse who was helping an elderly patient practice walking. The scene brought a smile to her face. This was exactly the kind of personal care she and Ben had worked so hard to maintain. In her new role as Director of Patient Care and Wellness, Caroline had transformed the hospital's approach to healing. The sterile, clinical atmosphere had given way to something warmer, more human. Plants brightened corners, comfortable seating areas invited conversation, and staff members weren't afraid to take time with their patients. She made her way to Ben's office, where he was reviewing the quarterly reports. He looked up as she entered, his face softening into a smile that still made her heart skip a beat. The tough exterior that had once intimidated her now felt like a comfortable sweater, warm and familiar. "The numbers from the wellness program are in," Caroline said, setting her tablet on his desk. "We're seeing exactly what we hoped for: shorter recovery times, higher satisfaction scores, and better staff retention." Ben nodded, his eyes scanning the data. "This is what happens when you treat people like people, not just patients or employees." He stood up and walked to the window, where they could see the hospital's new garden below. "Remember when this was just a parking lot?" Caroline joined him at the window. "And now look at it." The garden was filled with life. Patients doing physical therapy, families taking breaks from hospital rooms, staff members eating lunch in the sunshine. It's everything we dreamed it could be. They had worked hard to create this change. After their engagement, they'd thrown themselves into reimagining what a hospital could be. Ben's business acumen combined with Caroline's compassionate approach had created something unique, a place where healing meant more than just medical treatment. "The board meeting went well this morning," Ben said, turning to face her. "They've approved the expansion of the wellness program to our satellite clinics." His voice carried the pride he felt in their shared achievement. Caroline beamed. "That means we can help even more people." She thought about how far they'd come from those first tentative conversations in his hospital room. Back then, she'd been too shy to meet his eyes. Now, she stood beside him as an equal partner, both in life and in their mission to change healthcare. "You know what makes me happiest?" Ben asked, taking her hand. "Seeing you in your element. The way you connect with people, how you've helped change the culture here. You've inspired everyone, including me." Caroline squeezed his hand. "We did this together. Your strength gave me courage, and my perspective helped you see things differently." She looked around the office, remembering all the late nights they'd spent planning and dreaming. "We make a good team." Through the open door, they could hear the daily bustle of hospital life, conversations, gentle laughter, the sound of people caring for one another. It was so different from the tense, rushed atmosphere that had once defined St. Margaret's. Ben pulled Caroline close, and they stood together watching their vision unfold before them. The ring on her finger caught the sunlight, a reminder of all they'd built and all they still planned to create. The hospital had become more than just a place of healing. It was a testament to what could happen when two people dared to be vulnerable, to trust, and to believe in something bigger than themselves. Caroline stood in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting the emerald green evening gown she'd chosen for the hospital's annual fundraising gala. The dress sparkled under the bedroom lights, reminding her of how much her life had changed. A year ago, she would have found an excuse to skip such an event. Now, she felt a flutter of excitement in her stomach. Ben appeared behind her, his reflection showing him struggling with his bow tie. Despite being perfectly comfortable in board meetings, formal attire still gave him trouble. Caroline turned and reached up to help him, her fingers working deftly to create a perfect knot. "What would I do without you?" he asked, his deep voice soft with affection. "Probably wear clip-ons," she teased, smoothing his lapels. The tattooed man who had once intimidated her now felt like home. They drove to the hotel where the gala was being held, discussing their plans for the hospital's newest initiative. The wellness program had been such a success that other hospitals were starting to take notice. Caroline had already received invitations to speak at several healthcare conferences. "I never thought I'd be excited about public speaking," she admitted as they pulled up to the hotel. "But when it's about something you believe in..." "You've come so far," Ben said, helping her from the car. "We both have." The ballroom was transformed for the evening, with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over elegant table settings. Hospital staff, board members, and donors mingled, creating a buzz of conversation. Carolyn noticed how different it felt from previous years. There was a warmth to the interactions, a sense of shared purpose that hadn't existed before. Dr. Matthews, one of the longest-serving board members, approached them with a genuine smile. "The dynamic duo," he said warmly. "You've certainly proved me wrong. I wasn't sure about all these changes at first, but the results speak for themselves." Ben's arm tightened around Caroline's waist. "Sometimes the best business decision is to focus on the human element," he said. "Caroline taught me that." They made their way through the crowd, stopping to chat with nurses, doctors, and administrators. Carolyn felt a surge of pride hearing their stories, how the new programs had improved their work lives, how patients were responding better to treatment, how the hospital felt more like a community than ever before. When dinner was served, Ben stood to give his speech. Caroline watched him from their table, remembering the gruff, intimidating CEO she'd first met. He was still commanding, still powerful, but there was an accessibility to him now, a genuineness that drew people in rather than pushing them away. "A year ago," Ben began, "someone very special showed me what true strength looks like. It's not about maintaining control or keeping your distance. It's about having the courage to be vulnerable, to connect, to care." His eyes found Caroline's. "Thanks to her, St. Margaret's isn't just a hospital anymore. It's a place of healing in every sense of the word." Applause filled the room as Ben raised his glass. "To Caroline Winters, my partner in every way, and to all of you who have helped make our vision a reality." Carolyn felt tears prick her eyes as she stood to join him. Looking out at the faces of their hospital family, she saw the same pride and purpose she felt reflected back at her. They had done more than just improve a hospital. They had created a model for what healthcare could be, proving that compassion and success could go hand in hand. As the evening drew to a close, Ben led Caroline to the dance floor. They swayed together to the soft music, surrounded by the warmth of their shared achievement. The gala's music faded into softer melodies as the evening drew to a close. Carolyn leaned against Ben's chest as they swayed on the dance floor, her emerald dress shimmering under the chandelier's glow. His strong arms held her close, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through his tuxedo jacket. "Remember when you could barely look me in the eye?" Ben murmured, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. Caroline tilted her head up, meeting his gaze with confidence. "That feels like a lifetime ago," she said, "though you were pretty intimidating with all those tattoos and that stern CEO face." "Stern CEO face?" Ben chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "I was just trying not to show how nervous you made me." They moved in slow circles, watching as other couples enjoyed the last few dances of the evening. Dr. Matthews and his wife waltzed past, offering warm smiles. A group of nurses chatted animatedly near the dessert table, their laughter carrying across the room. "Look at what we've built together," Caroline said softly, gesturing to the room filled with their hospital family. "It's more than I ever dreamed possible." Ben's hand tightened on her waist. "You're the one who showed me what was possible. I was so focused on running a successful business, I'd forgotten what healthcare is really about." The orchestra began another song, and Caroline recognized the melody. It was the same one that had been playing during their first dance together, at that charity event that felt so long ago. She remembered how nervous she'd been then, still unsure of her place in Ben's world. "I have something to show you," Ben said, leading her away from the dance floor and towards the terrace doors. The night air was cool and fresh, and fairy lights twinkled in the surrounding gardens. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "What's this?" Caroline asked, taking it from him. "Open it." She unfolded the paper carefully. It was a newspaper clipping, dated just that morning. The headline read, "St. Margaret's Hospital sets new standard in healthcare. Wellness program to be adopted nationwide." "They want to implement your program across the country," Ben said, his voice full of pride. "You did that, Caroline. Your vision, your compassion, it's changing lives everywhere." Caroline felt tears welling up in her eyes as she read the article. Everything they'd worked for was coming to fruition. The lonely, insecure nurse she'd once been would never have believed this possible. Ben wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I love you," he said simply. "Thank you for showing me how to be human again." Carolyn turned in his embrace, reaching up to touch his face. The beard that had once seemed so intimidating now felt familiar under her fingers. His eyes, usually so guarded in public, were soft with emotion. "Ready to head home?" he asked, taking her hand in his. Caroline nodded, giving the glittering ballroom one last look. The evening had been perfect, a celebration not just of their professional achievements, but of their journey together. As they made their way through the lobby, their fingers intertwined, she felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what it felt like to be truly happy, truly fulfilled. To know that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, stronger for having found each other. Ben helped her into her coat, and they stepped out into the cool night air, hand in hand, ready to face whatever the future might hold. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story, and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.